Okay, so last time around I pointed out how in his interview with Mark Cuban, Sean Hannity was crediting Trump for the growing economy he inherited. This time around I'll address Hannity's rhetoric in regards to the debt and deficit. I've also appended lectures at the end for a deeper dive into the state of the economy. Sean, if you're watching, let's finally put that pen that you're always holding for no apparent reason to good use. Take some notes because you clearly haven't learned anything over the years.
What happened what happened to the deficit during the Obama administration, or what happened to the deficit to the Trump administration, even though Donald Trump said he would get rid of the deficit?
Hey,
that's
Mark,
number one.
Mark, stop. One at a time. Biden and Obama took on more debt than all 43 presidents and vice presidents before them combined. Fact.
Notice how Mark Cuban correctly points out that the Obama administration decreased the growing deficit they inherited, and Hannity quickly changed the subject to the debt. Cuban correctly points out that the debt only further increased under Trump, and Hannity proclaims that he's only had 3.5 years, as if there's any chance that Trump would do anything besides further increase the debt and the deficit. So let's unpack all of this. Barack Obama was inaugurated in January of 2009 when the economy was in a free fall and both the debt and deficit were skyrocketing due to revenue shortfalls from the economic downturn and George W. Bush's tax cuts. On top of that, because we were in the middle of the Great Recession, automatic stabilizers would be kicking in, which would automatically increase spending. Think of things like unemployment benefits. So yes, unavoidably, both the debt and deficit were skyrocketing. Nevertheless, by 2010, the deficit was shrinking. Now, real quick. Even the 2009 budget deficit technically belongs to George W. Bush because the budgets are set in October of the prior year. Not that it matters really. The point here isn't to blame Bush. It's just to note that this is how fiscal years work. Every president is inaugurated into a year where the fiscal budget was set in October of the prior year. The budget deficit did inevitably begin to creep up during the Obama years and well into the Trump years. However, Trump, unlike Obama, inherited a growing economy. He could have taken measures to reduce the deficit and eventually turn it into a surplus that would begin to chip away at the debt. But instead, he passed more tax cuts, including tax cuts on the wealthy, and he also cut taxes on corporations to historically low rates. Trump advocates like to credit the alleged economic growth on these tax cuts, but the data simply shows a continuation of the same economic trends since 2010. The argument that Obama added more debt than all previous presidents combined is just silly. For one, it's not true. In order to make this argument, you'd have to assign the fiscal year of 2008 to President Obama, which is ridiculous because he wouldn't be president until early 2009 and his first fiscal year would be in 2010. So this claim is untrue. But even if it were, it would still be a weaselly argument, as this doesn't even bother taking inflation into account. You can't count $1776 as if they're the equivalent of $2020. This is why economists measure debt as a percentage of GDP, or fix the amount to the dollar's value for a specific year. This helps ensure a more apples-to-apples comparison. But of course, Sean Hannity isn't interested in an honest analysis. He's a paid grifter. But I digress. Let's now focus on the history of taxes in the United States. Why can't we pay down this debt? Republicans want to focus on cutting spending, at least when that spending has to do with things like Medicare, and especially when a Democrat is in office. We now know that Medicare for all would actually save us money, on top of covering the uncovered 30 million Americans. But there is also the elephant in the room: taxes on the wealthy and on corporations are at historic lows. The GOP pretends to care about the debt and deficit whenever a Democrat is in office, or when progressives mention the concept of Medicare for all, which would cover all Americans. But the GOP doesn't care about either the debt or the deficit, which is why they keep cutting taxes on the wealthy and on corporations. And so after 40 years of tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, along with decades of union busting, we now have record income inequality in the United States. Not only are we back to our pre-New Deal levels of inequality, but we have the highest inequality of all advanced OECD nations, who, unlike us, have kept their New Deal-style initiatives and maintained strong unionization and higher taxes on the wealthy. As a result, they maintain a strong middle class, and their indicators show it, with long lifespans, lower infant mortality rates, higher math and literacy rates, as well as lower child poverty rates. By comparison, even before the pandemic, when the economy was allegedly strong again, 79% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck and were one emergency away from bankruptcy. Why? Because this 40-year experiment with Reaganomics has pushed all economic gains to the top at the expense of the middle class. The median income has fallen behind rising costs of living. Donald Trump's populist message turned out to be empty rhetoric. He is every bit the supply-side elite he bamboozled many Americans into thinking he actually opposed. It doesn't have to be this way. While Joe Biden is unlikely to be the next FDR, at the very least, he is not some oligarch who is going to continue the same trend, and his tax plan actually pushes us back in the right direction.
When the biggest tax exemptions and the lowest tax rates benefit the richest, all in the name of job creation, all that happens is that the rich get richer. Since 1980, the share of income for the top 1% of Americans has more than tripled, while our effective tax rates have gone down by 50%. If it was true that lower taxes for the rich and more wealth for the wealthy led to job creation, today we would be drowning in jobs. And thank you. And yet, unemployment and underemployment is at record highs. Another reason that this idea is so wrong-headed is that there can never be enough super-rich people to power a great economy. Somebody like me makes hundreds or thousands of times as much as the median American, but I don't buy hundreds or thousands of times as much stuff. My family owns 3 cars, not 3,000. I buy a few pairs of pants and shirts a year like most American men. Occasionally we go out to eat with friends. I can't buy enough of anything to make up for the fact that millions of unemployed and underemployed Americans can't buy any new cars, any clothes, or enjoy any meals out. Nor can I make up for the falling consumption of the vast majority of middle-class families that are barely squeaking by, buried by spiraling costs and trapped by stagnant or declining wages. Here's an incredible fact, that if the typical American family still retained the same share of income that they did in 1970, they'd earn like $45,000 more a year. Imagine what our economy would be like if that were the case. Speaking of special privileges, the extraordinary differential between the 15% tax rate that capitalists pay on carried interest, dividends, and capital gains, and the 35% top marginal rate on work that ordinary Americans pay, is kind of hard to justify without a touch of deification. We've had it backwards for the last 30 years. Rich people like me don't create jobs. Jobs are a consequence of an ecosystemic feedback loop between customers and businesses. And when the middle class thrives, businesses grow and hire, and owners profit. That's why taxing the rich to pay for investments that benefit all is such a fantastic deal for the middle class and the rich. So, ladies and gentlemen, here's an idea worth spreading. In a capitalist economy, the true job creators are middle-class consumers. And taxing the rich to make investments that make the middle class grow and thrive is the single shrewdest thing we can do for the middle class, for the poor, and for the rich. Thank you.
Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Let me give you a few things that people may not be aware of. The first is that the middle-class society I grew up in did not evolve gradually. You might think that there was there was the era of the robber barons, and then gradually America turned into the America of Ozzie and Harriet, whatever, that it gradually evolved into this middle-class society. That is not what the data or the available stories tell us. What they tell us is, in fact, that as far as we can tell, the Gilded Age lasted right through the 1920s. America, on the eve of the New Deal, was very nearly as unequal as it had been in the 1890s. And that the middle class, relatively egalitarian society was created in a very short period of time between the late 1930s and the end of World War II. The economic historians call it the Great Compression, because the income differences got compressed. And it's as important a story about 20th century America as the Great Depression, which we all know about, though it's much less told. And you look at what happened, and it was the Roosevelt administration, through a whole set of policies, but all of them equalizing. Much higher tax rates on the wealthy, higher corporate tax rates, a pro-union organizing environment, so you had an explosion in union membership, tripling of the share of the workforce, the minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, all of these things. And then the process accelerated because during World War II, there were extensive government controls on the economy, which were used in a way that tended to equalize incomes. All this created a middle-class society in a period of not more than about 7 or 8 years. Now, you might have thought, well, okay, but that's all artificial, especially the stuff during the war, so it would go away as soon as peacetime returned, but it didn't. Turns out that once you create institutions, norms, expectations of a relatively equal society, it tends to persist. So the income distribution, this relatively middle-class society that was created by the New Deal, persisted for more than a generation after World War II. Then it started to come apart, and you see this dramatic increase in inequality, not quite as fast as the Great Compression, but this dramatic increase starting around 1980, which in itself is kind of an interesting date because that's Reagan comes to the White House. And it turns out that the increase in inequality in the United States is unique to the United States. So other advanced countries have not seen anything like it. The closest thing you can see to the U.S., to this unequalization that's taken place in the United States is in Britain during the Thatcher years, which again is itself a little bit revealing. And nothing remotely, you just look at the charts and we are off the charts in terms of this increase in inequality. And many of the things that we take for granted as, well, this is the way things work in the modern, the late 20th, early 21st century economy, turn out to be special to the U.S. So one example I like to use is the decline of the union movement. We all know that unions are outmoded and you can't, it's global competition and all that. Except, well, here's a comparison people don't know. In the 1960s, Canada, that's the country up there. We tend to they almost speak the same language, eh? But anyway, in the 1960s, Canada and the United States had roughly the same percentage of their workers in unions, about 30% in both countries. Today, Canada still has almost 30% of its workers in unions. In the United States, it's down to about 11%, and much less than that, it's in the private sector. It's heavily a public sector thing left. So the deunionization was not something that happened because of the global economy, because Canada faces the same global economy we do. It was something that happened here. And how did it happen? Well, when you look into it closely, you discover that it was political. Basically, Ronald Reagan, above all, though it started before him, declared open season for union busters. During the 1980s, about 1 in every 20 workers who voted for a union was illegally fired. And the reason, sure, we're less of an industrial society, but there's no inherent reason why giant service sector companies, the iconic corporation of the 60s was General Motors, the iconic corporation of today is Walmart. There's no inherent reason why those companies should not be unionized. In fact, similar enterprises are in the rest of the world, but because the shift to a service economy took place in an environment in which politicians, the dominant political forces, said it was okay to bust unions in the way that people had in the 1920s, we've had this dramatic decline in unionization in the United States. So it is not, and that in turn has all kinds of ramifications for the income distribution. So I can talk about it at some length, but there's a lot of reason to believe that politics has driven this dramatic increase in inequality. Sure, technology is there, globalization is there, but it is very largely political. I should say one more thing. There's a a view on inequality that you hear all the time, which is, well, it's all about the increased demand for skills for education in the modern world economy. And there's no doubt something to that, but if you actually look at the numbers, the huge growth in disparities has not been between the college-educated and the non-college educated. Yes, people with college degrees have done better than people without, but most of the increase is among people with a lot of education. So that most dramatic statistic, high school teachers tend to have postgraduate degrees, and so do hedge fund managers. And as we all know, last year the highest paid hedge fund manager in the United States made an amount equal to the salaries of all 80,000 New York City school teachers for the next 3 years. So it's not education that is driving this. It's not that simple.